So yeah, this is going to be a presentation, as you probably already know, about how to improve UX with microinteractions, and essentially it's going to be a bit of an introduction also to the library Framer Motion. So I guess I'm going to probably try to split this presentation into two halves. The first half is going to be, I guess, what are microinteractions? Why are they useful, and why we should essentially use them in our websites. And then the second half is going to be a bit more of an explanation of what Framer Motion is, and I guess what is the developer's problems that it tries to answer and how we can use it pretty much. So to start with, I guess, what are microinteractions? Let me just, so what are microinteractions? So microinteractions are essentially small, preferably functional animation that support the user by giving visual feedback and displaying changes more clearly. So this is a kind of a broad definition, but the words that I like to focus on really is small, animation, and visual feedback. So whenever I think of microinteraction and whenever we discuss them, especially throughout this presentation, I mean any sort of UI changes. Usually these are going to be animations that are used to essentially convey some information to the user about what is happening and about what is the current state of the application that he's on. So whenever he clicks something, it's kind of like a feedback that the website has acknowledged his action and something is being processed or something is happening. So you can see how this could be useful. For example, I guess some of the pain points from users sometimes is, you can imagine you have a website, you click a button, and then nothing happens. You're not sure if you click the button correctly. You're not sure if you click outside of it. You're not sure if your Wi-Fi is slow. You're not sure if you have to re-click it maybe. And essentially what happens is you end up having a user that is confused, and you end up having a user that either spams the button or essentially just gives up on the website. It's not very interested. And as we all know, speed in web applications is crucial. And the faster our website is and the more responsive it is, the more users we're going to keep and have. So basically, these are just, there's a lot of types of microinteraction. I just listed here a bunch of examples. So some of the ones that you might think of that come to mind are really kind of like click effects, hover effects, whenever you scroll. Some other kind of like interesting ones that are now quite common is maybe the scroll into view. So if you have a long website, as you scroll, things essentially as they come into view, they animate and they pop up in a nice way. But also actually I wanted to put sound and other things because I'm going to mostly focus on animation, but strictly speaking, microinteractions don't have to be just visual. They could also be sound effects or anything, again, that gives a feedback to the user. So some examples could be, for example, just a navigation menu where clicking buttons animates the icon, or an add to cart in which there's kind of like a fun animation telling the user that the order has been processed or that something has indeed happened, or even like more commonly used probably forms in which we have some sort of animation for essentially fail or success. So if everything is good, we show some nice green happy animation. Something goes bad, we show a red animation giving user information about what he has done wrong. And then some of the maybe less thought about are things that are not necessarily user triggered, but they're more system triggered. So for example, a user might not have to do anything at all, but if someone, for example, in a chat application is on the other side texting, then we want to give feedback to the user about something that is happening just in the system of the whole application. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something done by the user himself. It can be just stuff that happens in the website. And that's why I like to focus about it's kind of like a feedback to the user about the current state. So I guess now we kind of know a bit maybe what they are. The reason is, I guess, why do we need them and why they're important? So in order to understand why we need microinteractions and why they're really crucial, especially in terms of the UX and the UI, is maybe if we have a look at the pyramid of user needs. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but this is kind of a pyramid that tries to explain what are the main needs of a user for him to use our product and keep using our product. Because essentially, at the end of the day, this is our goal, and this is what we want. We want users to use what we build. So we can see that it's, kind of like a pyramid of all the needs. At the very bottom, there's functional. Essentially, this means that the product needs to solve a business problem, or it needs to solve a user's problem. If it doesn't, we're not really solving a need, therefore it probably won't be used. This is very basics, I guess, and why we create websites in the first place, really. Second one is reliable. So reliable actually doesn't necessarily, so I guess this pyramid doesn't necessarily only affect websites. This is just products in general. So for a good example for reliability, for example, is a user might have a car. He wants the car to be reliable, doesn't want it to break down. Similarly, I guess for us, when we talk about software development, it could be we need our website to be bug-free, not to have too many bugs, or we need to have our website not crash if there's too many users like using it at the same time, right? So we want it to be stable and reliable. The third one, more important, is usable. So this essentially means the website needs to be easy to use. So there's a lot of websites, a lot of products that can be done, but sometimes it could be not very understandable on how to use it, or it could be hard to use. A good example of something bad is, say, if you want to go to a page and you need to navigate through 10 different pages to get to the end result. This just makes the whole experience less user-friendly and less usable. And finally, I guess pleasurable is kind of what we are going to be focusing on now when we talk about microinteractions, which means the user needs to enjoy using the website. If he doesn't enjoy it, he is unlikely to keep using it, or if he uses it, he's going to use it the bare minimum just to get what he wants out of it, essentially. So obviously, like when we talk about microinteractions, a lot of people think, okay, they're not as important. Obviously, I'm just going to focus on building an MVP that just does the core functionality. I'm not going to put too much effort into these tiny little details. And that is true. Obviously, you, as the pyramid shows, you need to focus on the functionality, reliability, and usability as well. It's kind of pointless to have a website that is pretty and pleasurable, but if it is not reliable, if it's full of bugs, for example. But I guess what I want to emphasize is that pleasurable is at the top of this pyramid. So a user will usually kind of assume that the website solves his needs. He will assume that it doesn't have bugs, but it's kind of these enjoyment process and this pleasure that will make him really like the product and keep using it. And especially this is true nowadays when we have loads of websites and many of them are similar, or like they essentially solve similar problems. So therefore, we need to make sure that our website stands out on top of the others. And how do we make sure? Probably almost all of them will be good websites, bug-free and stuff. But if we make sure that the user enjoys using ours, we can really make sure that he will essentially remember our website, go back to it, and also like share it to some of these other people. So I guess hopefully this kind of explains why we need them. Before we jump into, I guess, more the technical side of the presentation, I guess generally speaking, I guess I wanted to explain what usually makes a microinteraction so that we can better understand essentially when we come to the code, how to code it. So usually a microinteraction can be defined as a sequence of things. The first one will be the trigger. The trigger is, well, as the word says, what needs to trigger these microinteractions. So this, as the examples that we saw before, this trigger could be a user click, a mouse hovering over something. It could be the current state being in some position, for example, finishing a form, filling up the last number of a form. Or it could be a trigger in the system as well, like we said, for example, someone else in the chat talking to us. So even if we don't do anything, it could be a trigger done by someone else or by somehow else. The second one is the rules. The rules kind of determines, based on this trigger, is there any logic for which we want to show maybe one animation or another? For example, if we have the form, we need to check with these rules whether the form is valid or invalid in order to determine what we want to do next. So these are going to be all the business logic and the rules. And then thirdly, there is a feedback, which is, I guess, what we are more interested in and what we actually have to build. And this is kind of like the fun animation really of the of the website. And again, I guess I'm trying to sell them maybe a bit more by saying fun animation and stuff, but they really don't have to be. Very often, micro interactions are not even really noticeable. And the key is that you don't notice them being there, but you only notice it once they're not there, because they're kind of like very integral to the experience. And so you kind of take them for granted, and you only really notice them and therefore appreciate them once they're not there, and once the user experience is kind of broken by having an annoyed user just clicking through the website. And then the last one at the end is loops and modes. So this is sometimes relevant if we need some micro interactions or some animations to be happening with some loops, for example. So if we want, I don't know, an example could be snoozing an alarm. If we want something to be repeated every X minutes, every X seconds, this is essentially going to be a loop. And then it also comes to the question, okay, how do we break the loop if that's possible, and so on. So yeah, I guess we can then jump into the more second half of the, I guess, the code itself. So usually what we would do beforehand is that we could create CSS animations to give us all these animations and these fun things. So whenever we have a CSS animation, we have, for example, a div that has some sort of attributes, and then we want to animate it somehow. So what we do is that we give it an animation, and we maybe specify the time that it takes, the duration, and other fields. And then with keyframes, we define this animation. In this case, the animation is called example. And I'm saying that in this animation, over 4 seconds, I want the color to change from red to yellow to blue to green. So this is, I guess, my animation of changing colors. This is kind of fine and it works, to be fair, but what are the main problems of using CSS pure animations? So the first one is there is going to be a lot of code. So this may not necessarily be the case here on this example, but because I'm just changing the color and it's a very simple animation. But as you can imagine, once you start having animations that involve a lot of changes in terms of positions, sizes, rotations, colors, and whatnot, it becomes very, very big. Essentially, you start having lots of keyframes, you start having lots of animations, and your CSS file becomes very large very, very quickly. It's also a bit hard to read sometimes or to debug. For example, you can see how you have an animation set in the div, but then the actual animation is defined later on in the keyframe. So if you have lots of animations, you can see how you're going to end up having lots of keyframes, and it's just a bit maybe hard to keep track of everything in a clean and concise way. It's also separate from the TypeScript or JavaScript, whatever you're using, or essentially of your HTML and React code. This could be annoying, one from just readability point of view, but also if you need to have animations that have like JavaScript variables, whenever you need to have animations that have certain values, it's going to be really hard to translate that from your React component into a CSS file, especially once, you know, these keyframes are already quite complex. It's also a bit hard to manage user and system triggers. So here we can see that we have an animation, but nothing tells us when this animation should like kick in. So then we have to start introducing different classes and changing classes. And this is, I guess, the next point, which is if you have, say, a form that can take a normal state, a warning state, an error state, and a success state, then you start having loads of classes that correspond each one to different animations, and it gets a bit messy. Another con, I guess, is if you have sequential animation. So if you need something to move, say, up and then to move to the right, then you're going to need to start having animation delays, which is fine. But once you have to orchestrate a bunch of different actions, you start having to put a lot of delays, and it's quite hard to debug, because if you miss one delay and then you change the value, you then have to somehow change all the others to make sure that it flows very well. And yeah, I guess, as I said before, it's again hard to pass props and variables into the CSS. So I guess we can jump into the framework motion as an introduction. So I guess this is the problems and the issues and pain points that developers usually have when um, creating and coding animations. So what does Framer Motion do? Framer Motion essentially tries to make this all very simple and all within your React code. So to take the example of before, all we have to do with Framer Motion once we install it is we need to essentially, you can see we can import motion, and motion will have all of the HTML tags. So instead of a div, we now have a motion div. And all we have to do is we have to say that we give it an animate prop, and that prop will contain what used to be the keyframes before. So it contains what CSS property we want to change and how we want to change it. So from which values we want it to take. And if we want to also have more fine tuning about the duration and stuff, then we can also have this transition prop that takes, for example, how long the duration should be, if we wanted to repeat it, if we wanted to change the percentage of the keyframes, which by default are just kind of like evenly spread. And so this makes it quite nice and easy. And then on top of it, it also allows us to have to handle some of the most common triggers, such as like click, hover, and all the other ones, by having specific properties for them. So for example, here, while tap, I can say, okay, while I'm tapping the button, I wanted to shrink a little bit to a scale of like 0.9. And similarly, you have a bunch of other props that you can take to change to animate your motion div while hovering, while focusing, while it enters a viewport, etc., etc., and even on drag, because Framer Motion also allows for drag and drops. So actually, we can see that the benefits and the solutions that it fixed is that this is now very little code. We now only really have 2 props, animate and transition, in 2 lines. So we changed 10 lines into 2, and you can see how as it grows, it's gonna kind of stay smaller. It's also a bit easier to read and debug. Everything is one place. Everything is within the div. It's quite nice to look at, really, and read. It's within the TypeScript, which also fixes the problems of potentially the need of passing props and variables. And it is a little bit easier to manage user system triggers. I haven't put this in green because, as I said, it can help for handling things like tapping, clicking, hovering, entering the viewport. So these are very common system triggers that are already handled. But if you have some different triggers, which is, for example, a completely different state in your app, then again, it becomes a little bit tricky. And I can show you how we can use other things in Framer Motion to make this a lot simpler. And based on what I showed, there are still technically 2 issues that we have, which is if you have, for example, back to the form examples that has lots of different states and lots of different potential animations, it becomes kind of hard with this method to handle them. And again, if things need to be done sequentially, we still need some delays. So essentially, this is how to use Framer Motion for very simple animations. If we want more complex animations, such as these ones that I guess I'm going to show, then we can use things such as variants and controllers. So, very briefly, essentially what variants are is that variants define all the different types of animation that the div could have. So for example, you have variants for the div being hidden, one for the div being visible, one, for example, for the div expanding, and these are all kind of very well-defined animation or states that the element could have. And then essentially you just pass them to the motion div. So now this motion div can handle all of these different variants and all of these different states. So what you do, you just you say initially what you want it to be. For example, you can say at the beginning to start with, I want it to be hidden, so with opacity 0. And now that your motion div handles all these variants, all you have to do now is use what is called the controls that you have with use animations. So now you pass the controls into the animate, And you now have access to this hook that you can use to trigger and change between all of these different states. So for example, if you want to trigger an animation at a very specific moment, you can just create a function that does it, called handle animation in this case. For example, this is for the form, is it valid, is it not valid? And then within your animation, you can just call all of these animation states. So you can say, okay, I now wanted to go from hidden to visible, I wanted to expand, and I wanted to either go into error state or success state based on whether it's valid or not. And this also solves the other issue of having things sequentially, because as you can see, this is an asynchronous function, and I can now use await. So I can say I wanted first to be visible, then I wanted to expand, then I wanted to change color. So now it already removes all of the issue of, okay, I need delays, I need 2 seconds here, 2 seconds there, is all done like systematically, very neat. So yeah, I guess the 3 questions that were still a bit unanswered are now kind of fixed with this method, because now it's very easy to manage user and system triggers. We now can create functions that handle them, and we can call those functions whenever we want, in whichever case we want. It's also very simple, as you can see here, to handle many different types of animation with what used to be before lots of different classes. Your motion div has all the variants, and you just need to call them as you like. And as I just said, yeah, it kind of gets rid of the issue of sequential animations, because you can use the await, and you can just wait until one animation is done to start the next one. So this is kind of it. I guess before maybe leaving the thing to questions, I wanted to show maybe an example of something that can be done with Framer Motion. So I guess this is just a very simple animation in which there's a button that drops down, expands, and as it expands, you can see the little button that rotates. And then, for example, maybe as you hover, you want it to be bigger, and as you click it, you want it to rotate and change color. And essentially, this becomes super easy with Framer Motion, because all you have to do is that you have to say, initially, I want it to be invisible. Then once it, the page loads, I want it to drop, then expand, then rotate. And then you can add a bunch of common triggers, such as on hover, I want it to scale up, on click, I want it to rotate. And then once again, like on click, I can toggle between the states of valid or not valid, and I can make it green or red. So this is a very simple case of stuff that would otherwise be quite annoying and painful to do with CSS animations. Otherwise, some bigger examples could be here, for example, a card input for a credit card payment, for example. So actually, Framer Motion also allows 2 things that I haven't mentioned yet, which are really, really cool, which is SVG animations and drag and drop. So as you can see here, when it loads, I have an SVG that goes around to create the kind of impression of creating the card. And then the second one is you have drag and drop. So I can actually drag and drop this card around. And you can see that also it has a lot of very useful hooks in terms of for the drag and drop that keep track of the position. And you can use these to then, for example, change the color. As you can see here, as I drag it, it changes the color. And this is essentially in Framer Motion, is just kind of a 2-3 lines worth of code, and it's just very simple, which otherwise will probably be quite hard. We can then add like validation steps, and for example, if fields are not filled, we can shake, bring these cards into colors. We can then, I guess, try to enter the form, give expiration dates, and so on. We can tilt it, and then I guess, like I said, because we also are able to do any kind of SVG animation, we can do some cool stuff about, for example, when I pay, I want it to close and have a nice green tick, which is then again draggable. So this is, I guess, a bit more of a complex example that I guess I wanted to show, just to show to what extent we can use Framer Motion to pretty much do everything we can think of. The good thing is that it makes it easy for us instead of having to deal with all the CSS. So I guess I'm gonna stop here and leave the floor open to any questions that people might have. I hope it was clear enough, and yeah, feel free to either ask or just drop it in the chat, any questions you might have.
Yeah, I have one. or a
Yes.
couple. But the first one is you mentioned that you can, well, that the when you're handling animations from a, like a system trigger, you use an async function and then wait for all the kind of changing states. What if I want to play or run multiple animation at once, like scaling and changing the color at the same time, for example?
Then essentially all you have to do is not to use the await. So you just call the controllers and you say, I want to trigger these three animations, and you just call them without the await. So essentially they're just gonna happen synchronously at the same time, and they're just gonna, like, I guess, animate together.
Nice.
But it's up to you whether you choose to use the await. I guess the await is just a way to it's just, I guess, a nice
Making it
way for
synchronous.
to handle like delays essentially. But if you don't want delays, then you don't have to use it, obviously.
Perfect. Thank you.
Does firmware motion introduce any performance issues to an application? Not that I have noticed. I've used it quite a bit and I haven't necessarily noticed anything. The one thing that I guess I will say that you may want to consider or bear in mind is that it is quite a big npm library to install. So if you check the bundle size, I don't necessarily remember what it is, but it is more of a, a larger, heavier app, which I guess depending on situations is something that you may want to consider. I guess usually, strictly speaking, I think if you use frame and motion to kind of handle all the kind of micro interactions and animation in your website, it just means that you just get a lot of bang for your buck, and it is very useful. And maybe an initial slightly slower load will will not be really relevant in terms of like all the positives things that you will have. If you just need, for example, maybe to use frame of motion just for one very specific complex animation, then maybe in that case you may want to think about I don't know, lazy loading that component so that it only loads the whole library for that one maybe page, because I guess maybe you don't want to necessarily load the whole thing every time.
Uh, does it work with React Native?
No, it does not work with React Native. I think I'm not sure if they're planning on it, but at the moment it's kind of strictly just for React.
Okay.
AJ asked another question about, do you have any recommended ways to survey evaluate if our micro interactions are actually helping user to have reasonable visual feedbacks or even pleasured experience from our product? I don't actually have any stats like numbers on this, so um, yeah, I guess my answer will just mostly be based on, I guess, experience and feedbacks that we've gotten from clients and stuff using it. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have necessarily numbers to back up my claims. I hope I hope I convinced you enough at some point. But yeah, it would be cool to be fair though, to maybe have some sort of um, analysis done in regards, just to see exactly maybe uh, you know it helps, yes, but maybe to pinpoint to what extent does it help, that's maybe more of a question, because then if you want to evaluate like the pros and cons of time spent doing it and revenue gained or whatever, then maybe it could be useful to have some figures in terms of that. But I don't have any as of now, sorry. Cool. Anything else from anyone? Right, I guess that's I'll take this as a no. So yeah, thanks a lot for everyone for joining. Hope it was useful, and yeah, let me know if you have any other questions. But thanks a lot. Oh, is Framer React exclusive? What do you mean by exclusive? Sorry. Do you mean if you have Framer, then oh, can use it on Angular and Vue? I assume, I'm pretty sure you can. I use it with React, but there's no reason why. All it does is essentially translates CSS animations into HTML, kind of like, for example, a div. So it essentially attaches styles to HTML tags. So I don't see why it shouldn't work with Angular or Vue. So I'm pretty sure it should work with, I think it's like framework agnostic, yeah. All right, thanks a lot, guys. It was great talking to you, and yeah, hopefully you learned something from it, and yeah, it was nice talking to you. Bye-bye.